On the northern island of Hokkaido, in a country whose national identity is built around the idea of cultural and ethnic homogeneity, there lives a people who do not fit that story at all. They are not Japanese, not in any genetic sense that population science recognizes. They are not Korean. They are not Chinese. For nearly 2 centuries, anthropologists struggled to place them anywhere on the map of East Asian ancestry, and for nearly 2 centuries, the answer kept returning to the same uncomfortable conclusion. They belong to something older than the categories built to describe them. These are the Ainu, and the story their genome tells is not simply about who they are. It is about who almost everyone in East Asia used to be, before the world they came from was overwritten by something else. For most of the 20th century, the Ainu were treated by the Japanese state and by much of the academic world as a curiosity at the margins of a national story that had little room for them. Official Japanese policy for decades pursued active assimilation, banning the Ainu language in schools, suppressing traditional practices, encouraging intermarriage with the broader Japanese population, and promoting an ideology of Japanese ethnic homogeneity that simply had no category for a people who did not fit the framework. The Ainu were physically distinct in ways that 19th and early 20th century observers noted constantly, sometimes respectfully, often with the racialized condescension typical of the period. Lighter skin in some individuals, heavier facial and body hair than is typical among East Asian populations, distinct facial structure. Early Western anthropologists speculated wildly, proposing Caucasian origins, proposing connections to ancient European populations, proposing nearly every theory except the one that turned out, eventually, to be closest to correct. The Ainu have their own answer to who they are, and it has nothing to do with any of those theories. Their oral traditions describe an ancient and continuous relationship with the northern islands, a spiritual cosmology centered on the bear, the salmon, and the forest, and a way of life built around hunting, fishing, and gathering that persisted for thousands of years, while agricultural societies rose and transformed the world around them. For a long time, the question of how literally to take this claim of deep continuity was a matter of speculation. The DNA has now made it a matter of measurement. The first serious genomic studies of Ainu ancestry, conducted in the 2000s and expanded significantly in the 2010s, revealed something that reoriented the entire framework for understanding the population history of East Asia. The Ainu are the most direct living descendants of the Jomon people, the hunter-gatherer population that occupied the Japanese archipelago for over 10,000 years before the arrival of rice agriculture, and the population movements that would eventually produce what we now call the Yayoi culture, and, ultimately, the genetic and cultural foundation of mainland Japanese identity. The Jomon period is, by any measure, one of the longest continuous cultural traditions documented anywhere in the archaeological record. Beginning around 14,000 years ago and lasting until roughly 300 BCE, the Jomon people developed one of the earliest pottery traditions in the world, built complex hunter-gatherer settlements with surprising permanence and social organization, and lived in apparent demographic and cultural stability across a span of time that dwarfs the entire history of most subsequent civilizations. They were not a marginal or peripheral population. For most of human prehistory in East Asia, they were simply how people in the Japanese archipelago lived. Then, beginning around 300 BCE, populations from the Korean peninsula and the Asian mainland began arriving in increasing numbers, bringing wet rice agriculture, bronze and iron metallurgy, and a different genetic profile, more closely related to mainland East Asian populations. This is the Yayoi migration, and it transformed the Japanese archipelago demographically and culturally over the following centuries. The genomic data shows clearly that modern mainland Japanese populations carry a mixture of Jomon and Yayoi ancestry, with Yayoi-derived ancestry predominant in most regions, especially in western and central Japan. But in Hokkaido, in the far north, the demographic replacement was far less complete. The Ainu retained, and continue to carry today, an overwhelmingly higher proportion of Jomon ancestry than any other living population on Earth. In some genomic analyses, the Jomon component in Ainu genomes approaches or exceeds 70%, compared to roughly 10 to 20% in the genomes of mainland Japanese populations. This is the first part of the answer. The Ainu are not a mysterious population with no place in the story. They are, more precisely than almost any other group on Earth, the genetic continuation of the oldest known population of the Japanese archipelago. The mystery, in this framing, dissolves into something clearer and in some ways more remarkable. They held on, in the far north, to an ancestry that the rest of the archipelago largely lost. But this is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because the Jomon themselves, the foundational population whose legacy the Ainu carry forward, are not easily placed within the standard East Asian migratory framework either. When researchers sequenced ancient Jomon DNA directly, from skeletal remains recovered across Japan and dated to various points within the 10,000-year span of the Jomon period, they found a population that diverged from the ancestors of mainland East Asians at a surprisingly deep point in human population history, likely tens of thousands of years before the Jomon culture itself began. The Jomon, in genetic terms, represent one of the earliest branching lineages of the broader East Asian population tree, a lineage that separated from the ancestors of mainland Northeast Asians, Southeast Asians, and the populations that would eventually cross into the Americas, at a point so early that the Jomon genome retains signals that have been lost or heavily diluted almost everywhere else in East Asia. This places the Ainu, through their Jomon ancestry, in an unusual position in the broader map of human population history. They are not simply an isolated regional variant of mainland Japanese ancestry. They are a living connection to one of the deepest and most ancient branches of the East Asian population tree, a branch that elsewhere has been almost entirely absorbed, diluted, or replaced by subsequent migrations over the past several thousand years. And there is a further layer that genomic research has only recently begun to clarify. Some analyses of the deep structure of Jomon ancestry suggest affinities with ancient populations along the broader Pacific Rim, including signals that connect, distantly and through deep time, to the population history of indigenous peoples of the Americas, and to ancient populations of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The genetic architecture of the Jomon lineage appears to sit near a critical branching point in the deep history of how humans spread across and around the Pacific Basin, a point at which several of the major population lineages of the Pacific Rim, East Asian, Pacific Islander, and the founding populations of the Americas had not yet fully separated from one another. This does not mean the Ainu are somehow ancestral to Pacific Islanders or to indigenous Americans in any direct sense. The relationship is much deeper and more diffuse than that, a shared deep branch rather than a direct line of descent. But it means that the population the Ainu most directly descend from sits at a genuinely pivotal point in the broader story of how the Pacific world's populations came to be distinct from one another. There is a phrase that appears with some regularity in the population genetics literature on this subject, the description of certain deep East Asian and Pacific lineages as part of what researchers sometimes informally call the coastal route, the hypothesized ancient migration of early modern humans along the southern coastline of Asia, a movement that predates and partially parallels the inland migrations that produced most of the population history we are more familiar with. The Jomon lineage, and through it the Ainu, appear to preserve genetic signals consistent with a population that branched early from this coastal expansion, one of the threads of the broader human dispersal across Asia and the Pacific that took a path different from, and earlier than, the agricultural migrations that would later dominate the genetic landscape of most of East Asia. What this means, in practical terms, is that the Ainu carry within their genome a kind of living archive of a phase of human population history in East Asia and the Pacific that has otherwise been almost entirely overwritten. Not erased, the way the Neolithic farmers of Europe were genetically overwritten by the Yamnaya expansion, but persisting at the margins, in the one place where geography and the particular history of contact with later migrations allowed an older population structure to survive largely intact. The geography itself offers part of the explanation. Hokkaido sits at the northern edge of the Japanese archipelago, separated from Honshu by the Tsugaru Strait, and historically more closely connected, in terms of climate and ecology, to the Russian Far East and Sakhalin, than to the rice-growing regions further south. The Yayoi agricultural package, centered on wet rice cultivation, required a climate and growing season that Hokkaido's colder environment did not easily support. For over 1,000 years after Yayoi populations had transformed most of Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku, Hokkaido remained outside the agricultural frontier, populated by successor cultures to the Jomon, including the Satsumon and Okotsk cultures, who would eventually coalesce into what we now recognize as Ainu culture by around the 13th century. Geography did not just preserve a people, it preserved an entire trajectory of human history that the rest of the archipelago had already left behind. The Ainu were never a peripheral mystery in the story of East Asia. They are, in a very real genomic sense, one of the clearest remaining windows into what East Asia and the broader Pacific world looked like before the great agricultural migrations of the last several thousand years reshaped almost everything else. The political and cultural dimensions of this finding have not been simple. For decades, the suppression of Ainu identity by the Japanese state was justified, implicitly or explicitly, by a narrative of national homogeneity that treated the Ainu's distinctiveness as either irrelevant or as evidence of an inferior, more primitive population that history had naturally superseded. The genomic findings complicate that narrative in ways that Japanese scholars and Ainu advocates have both begun to engage with directly. In 2008, the Japanese government formally recognized the Ainu as an indigenous people for the first time, a recognition that came only after decades of advocacy, and one that the genomic confirmation of deep Ainu-Jomon continuity has reinforced rather than created. What the DNA cannot do is restore what was suppressed. The Ainu language, classified as critically endangered, has only a small number of fully fluent speakers remaining. Traditional practices, deliberately disrupted across generations of assimilation policy, are being rebuilt by communities working with incomplete records and a cultural memory that survived despite, not because of, the institutions that were supposed to preserve it. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the deepest and most ancient genetic lineage in East Asia survived not in a place of power, not in a place that history chose to celebrate, but at the literal margins of a national story that actively worked to erase it. The Jomon people lived in the Japanese archipelago for longer than agriculture has existed in most of the world. Their descendants held on, in the cold northern forests of Hokkaido, to a thread of human continuity that connects, however distantly, to some of the oldest population divergences anywhere in the human story. The Ainu were never a footnote to Japanese history. They are, in the precise language of population genetics, one of its oldest chapters, still being read, still being lived, in a place the rest of the story almost succeeded in writing them out of entirely. History, as it turns out, does not require permission to survive. It only requires somewhere, however small, however cold, however far from the center of power, where it can keep going.